We think we know the Norse gods, Thor, Odin, Loki, but what if these were not tales of heroes? What if they were the desperate prayers of a people living at the edge of the world? A people whose gods were as cruel and unforgiving as the landscape around them. Take a deep breath. Feel the cold air fill your lungs. Imagine you're standing on the shore of a Norwegian fjord. The water is black and deep. The mountains are immense and silent. This was the world of the Norse, and it's where our story begins tonight. If you enjoyed journeys like this, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. I love knowing where these stories are heard, so feel free to leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, in Bedtime History, we travel back over 1,000 years, not to the golden halls of Asgard, but to the cold, hard soil of Midgard. Midgard's cruel embrace. This was the name the Norse people gave to the world of mortals. Their world was not a gentle place. It was a realm carved from ice and stone, a land of deep shadows and fleeting light. To understand their gods, we must first understand the ground beneath their feet and the cold air in their lungs. Imagine the geography of Scandinavia. It is a land of dramatic and unforgiving beauty. Great mountains rise like jagged teeth against a gray sky, their peaks often lost in cloud. From these mountains, fjords cut deep into the coastline. These were not gentle bays, but immense saltwater gorges, their dark waters plunging to impossible depths. The cliffs on either side were sheer and forbidding. Travel by land was a monumental effort, and so the fjords became their highways, their lifelines to a wider, yet equally dangerous world. Beyond the fjords lay the forests. These were not the managed woods of today. They were vast, primeval places, dark and dense, with ancient pine and birch. The canopy was so thick that little light reached the forest floor. It was a place of silence, a silence broken only by the cry of a raven or the snap of a twig under a heavy paw. Here, a person could become lost in moments, swallowed by the endless trees. The people of the Norse world clung to the edges of this landscape. Their arable land was scarce, just small, precious patches of soil in valleys or along the coast where they could wrestle a meager existence from the earth. This constant struggle for space, for a single field to grow crops, shaped their entire lives. The climate was an even greater tyrant. The summers were short, a frantic burst of green and life under a sun that barely set. This was the time for planting, for mending, for preparing, because everyone knew what was coming: the winter. Winters in the north were long, they were dark, they were profoundly, existentially cold. The Norse people spoke of a wolf month, a time in the deepest heart of winter when the cold was a predator, stalking the very edges of their survival. For months, the sun would be a weak, fleeting ghost on the horizon. The world would be rendered in shades of white and gray. Snow would bury the landscape, isolating communities for weeks or months at a time. The darkness was not just physical, it was a psychological weight. It pressed down on the spirit, a constant reminder of the world's fragility and their own. This brutal cycle of seasons dictated their diet and their constant dance with starvation. Their life was one of subsistence. They farmed hardy grains like barley and oats, which they ground into coarse flour for bread and porridge. This was the staple of their diet. It was simple, and often it was not enough. They fished, relentlessly. The cold waters of the Atlantic and the North Sea were rich with herring and cod. These fish were a vital source of protein, but catching them was a dangerous gamble against the treacherous waters. Hunting provided what it could from the dark forests. The ever-present threat of famine was a shadow that loomed over every single decision. A poor harvest, a long winter, or a failed fishing season could mean the difference between life and death for an entire community. This precarious existence meant that food preservation was not a convenience, it was an essential art of survival. Fish and meat were salted, dried, or smoked, activities that filled the air with their pungent, inescapable smells. Every edible resource was carefully managed, a bulwark against the coming cold. Because of this harsh landscape, settlements were not sprawling cities. They were small, scattered farmsteads, often isolated from one another by miles of unforgiving terrain. A village might be just a handful of longhouses clustered in a defensible position near a fjord. This geographic isolation had a profound effect on their society. It fostered an intense reliance on kinship. The family, or the clan, which they called the JT, was the absolute center of their world. It was their government, their army, and their only true safety net. Your loyalty to your JT was absolute. An insult to one member was an insult to all. A blood feud could last for generations, a grim legacy passed down through the long winters. At the heart of each farmstead, and at the center of this clan life, stood the longhouse. This was not just a home. It was the social and spiritual core of their existence. Picture a long, low building made of timber and turf, its roof thatched to keep out the relentless wind and snow. Inside, a single, vast room stretched into the dimness. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke. A central fire pit provided the only significant source of light and warmth. Its flames cast flickering shadows on the faces of the people gathered around it. Smoke stung the eyes and coated the rafters with a dark, greasy soot. This space was shared by everyone: the chieftain and his family, their retainers, their servants, and sometimes, during the harshest winters, their most valuable livestock would be brought inside for protection. Life was lived publicly in the smoky twilight of the longhouse. Their technology was simple but effective. Tools were forged from iron, axes to fell trees, plows to turn the stubborn soil, and knives for every task imaginable. But without advanced machinery, every single task required immense physical labor. Building a longhouse, clearing a field, or preserving a large catch of fish was a communal effort that drained the energy of the entire settlement. Travel was difficult and dangerous, reinforcing the isolation of each small community. This life of constant hardship took its toll on their bodies. Health was a fragile gift. The average life expectancy was shockingly low, hovering around 30 to 40 years. Many did not even survive childhood. Infant mortality was tragically common, a constant source of grief. People died from disease, from malnutrition during a bad winter, and from the ever-present threat of violence. Life was short, and it was brutal. Within this tough world, society was strictly hierarchical. At the top were the jarls, the chieftains and local lords, who held power through wealth, influence, and martial prowess. Below them were the carls, the vast majority of the population. These were the freemen, the farmers, the merchants, and the warriors. They owned land and had rights under the law. And at the very bottom were the thralls, the slaves. These were people captured in raids or born into servitude. They had no rights and their lives were entirely at the mercy of their owners. This social structure helps us understand one of the most famous aspects of their culture, the Viking raids. These were not always acts of wanton violence for its own sake. In a resource-poor land where famine was a constant neighbor, raiding was often a brutal but necessary economic activity. It was a way to gain resources that were simply unavailable at home. Wealth in the form of gold and silver, and slaves to work the farms. It was a violent solution to the fundamental problem of survival in a cruel land. All of this, the land, the climate, the constant struggle, and the short, violent lives, cultivated a deep and abiding belief in a concept they called word. We might translate it as fate or destiny. But it was more than that. Word was an active, unchangeable force. The Norse people believed that the course of a person's life, and especially the moment of their death, was predetermined. It was a thread woven by cosmic beings from the moment of birth. This was not a comforting belief. It was a stark acceptance of a world where they had very little control. It bred a kind of fatalistic courage. If your end was already written, you might as well face it with bravery. This harsh land was bordered by an even more terrifying realm, the sea. For the Norse, the ocean was not just water. It was a living entity ruled by gods of the unforgiving sea. The sea was everything to the Norse people. It was a source of life, offering the bounty of fish that kept starvation at bay. It was a highway, the only practical path for trade, for exploration, and for the raids that defined their age. But it was also a vast, cold graveyard, an unpredictable monster that could swallow ships and men without a trace. Their relationship with the sea was one of deep respect and even deeper fear. And this relationship was personified by their gods. The key to their mastery of this dangerous world was their vessel, the longship. This was a masterpiece of naval engineering, a revolutionary design that gave them an unparalleled advantage. They were clinker-built, meaning the hull planks overlapped, creating a strong yet flexible structure. The ships could literally bend with the waves, absorbing the immense stress of the open ocean. They had a shallow draft, allowing them to not only cross the vast North Sea, but also to navigate far up shallow rivers, striking deep into the heart of other lands without warning. It was both a beautiful and a terrifying creation. For calm seas and prosperous journeys, the Norse would pray to Njara. He was a god of the Vanir, an older family of deities associated with wealth, fertility, and nature. Njara represented the sea in its benevolent mood. He was the giver of wealth from fishing, the god who guided gentle winds to fill their sails. Sailors would make offerings to him, hoping for safe passage and a hull filled with fish or treasure. But they knew Njaga's power was limited. He was the god of the calm harbor, not the raging storm. For the ocean's raw, untamable power, they looked to another figure, a Jatun or giant named Jair. He was the personification of the ocean itself. He was not a god to be worshipped, but a force to be feared and appeased. The legends say he brewed ale for the gods in a massive kettle. That kettle was the ocean. When a storm raged, the Norse people would say that Jair was brewing. The great walls of foam crashing on the rocks were the froth from his divine ale. If Jair was the raw power of the ocean, his wife, Rast, was its sinister, grasping malice. Her name literally means robber or plunderer. She was a far more terrifying figure. The myths describe her possessing a great dark net. When a ship was caught in a storm, and its mast snapped and its hull was breached, it was Ras, who was waiting below. She would cast her net, capturing the souls of the sailors who drowned, dragging them down to her cold, dark hall at the bottom of the sea. Gur and Ar were said to have 9 daughters. These were not gentle maidens, but the personifications of the different types of waves. Each name was a poem of the sea's character. One was Himinglava, the wave through which one can see the heavens. Another was Uada, the one with bloody hair, perhaps for the red seaweed caught in the surf, or the blood of doomed men. These daughters were the sea's many moods, its endless, changing faces. This belief in Rand her net created a distinct and bleak view of the afterlife for those lost at sea. A warrior who died in battle might go to Odin's hall, Valhalla, but a man who drowned, no matter how brave, belonged to round to round. His afterlife was not a glorious one of feasting and fighting. It was to be a guest in her cold, damp hall, forever trapped in the sunless depths. This was a powerful incentive to fight to the last breath on deck, rather than be washed overboard. Navigating this deadly realm was a matter of skill, memory, and instinct. Their methods were what we would consider primitive today. They often practiced coastal hugging, keeping the shoreline in sight. On the open ocean, they relied on an intimate knowledge of currents, the flight patterns of seabirds, and the position of the sun. Sagas mention a mysterious object called or sunstone. This might have been a type of crystal that could polarize light, allowing them to find the sun's position even on a cloudy day. Their fleets were diverse, with ships built for specific purposes. The most famous was the Drakar, or dragon ship, the iconic warship with its terrifying carved prow. These were built for speed and intimidation, for trade and exploration. They used the Nair. This was a wider, deeper vessel designed to carry cargo, livestock, and settlers across the vast distances of the North Atlantic. And for daily life along the coast, they used smaller boats, like the Carvi, for fishing and local travel. The terror of the sea was not limited to storms and drowning. The Norse believed the deep-held monstrous secrets. They told tales of the half-gufa, a colossal sea creature that was often mistaken for an island. And they spoke of the kraken, a beast of immense size with tentacles that could pull an entire ship down into the abyss. Encircling the entire world of Midgard in the deepest ocean lay Jarmungandr, the world serpent, a monstrous child of the god Loki, so enormous that he could bite his own tail. His stirring in the depths was enough to cause tidal waves and earthquakes. Faced with such a terrifying and unpredictable force, the Norse people did what humans have always done. They tried to bargain. Archaeological finds and ancient texts suggest that they made offerings to the sea and its gods. Before a long journey, a chieftain might throw a valuable sword or a piece of gold into the waves, a gift to appease Jaeger and Ra. There are even darker suggestions of sacrifices made to ensure safe passage. It was a world where you paid a price for survival. But for all the terror of the sea, the greatest fear and reverence was reserved for the god who oversaw the fates of kings and warriors, the one-eyed wanderer who demanded sacrifice, Odin, the terrible father. The figure of Odin that we often imagine is one of a wise, noble king, a benevolent father figure ruling justly over the gods in Asgard. This is a comforting image. It is also deeply misleading. The Odin worshipped by the Norse people was a far more complex and far more terrifying deity. He was a god of war, of death, of magic, and of a terrifying, ecstatic fury. To understand him, we must start with his name. Odin is related to the Old Norse word, ar. This word does not mean wisdom or nobility. It means fury, ecstasy, or frenzied inspiration. This is the core of his being. He is not a god of calm reason, but of chaotic, overwhelming power. The kind of power that seizes a poet with inspiration, or a warrior with a battle madness that erases all fear and all mercy. This was the fury that his followers sought to channel. Odin was known by many names, and one of his most unsettling was the god of the hanged. He had a deep and dark connection to this form of death. It was a common method of human sacrifice offered to him. Victims would be hanged from the boughs of a sacred tree, a grim tribute to the Allfather. This association comes from Odin's own history. In his relentless pursuit of power, he made the ultimate sacrifice, himself to himself. He hanged himself from a branch of Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 days and 9 nights. He was wounded with a spear and offered no food or drink. In this state of torment between life and death, the secrets of the runes were revealed to him. This was not his only act of self-mutilation for knowledge. He famously gave up one of his eyes, dropping it into the well of a source of cosmic wisdom. In exchange, he gained unparalleled insight. This is the portrait of a god who understands a fundamental, brutal truth, that all true power, all deep knowledge, comes at a terrible price. He is a god who demands sacrifice, because he himself has sacrificed parts of his own being for power. On the battlefield, his influence was felt in its most terrifying form. Certain elite warriors, known as the Berserkers and the Gnar, would enter a trance-like fury before a battle. They would howl like animals, bite the rims of their shields, and cast aside their armor, seemingly immune to pain. They believed they were channeling the spirit of Odin, becoming possessed by the spirits of bears or wolves. They were a terrifying psychological weapon, the embodiment of the god's battle frenzy. Even his most famous creation, Valhalla, was not a heaven for the righteous. It was a military barracks. Odin did not choose the souls of the good or the kind. He sent his Valkyries to choose the souls of the bravest warriors who died in battle. These chosen dead, the Einherjar, would spend their afterlife feasting and fighting every day. But this was not their reward. It was their training. Odin was gathering the greatest army he could, preparing for the final, doomed battle of Ragnarök. The Einherjar served his needs, not the other way around. In the folklore of the people, Odin often appeared in a frightening form. He was the leader of the wild hunt. On stormy winter nights, it was said that Odin would ride across the sky on his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir. He led a ghostly procession of the dead, their hounds howling on the wind. To witness the wild hunt was a terrible omen. It foretold war, plague, or the death of the person who saw it. He was a specter of doom, a king of ghosts. He was also a god of deceit and manipulation. He wandered the world in disguise, often as a cloaked, gray-bearded old man with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low to hide his missing eye. He used many false names, like the Masked One, or R, the Victory Advisor. He would trick giants and kings alike, always for his own ends, which were not always noble. He was a master of strategy, and his morality was entirely his own. His desire for knowledge was insatiable, and it fed a need for control. He was served by 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin. Their names mean thought and memory. Every day they would fly across all the worlds, and every evening they would return to perch on Odin's shoulders and whisper all that they had seen and heard. He was the spymaster god, constantly gathering information, always aware of the secrets and plots unfolding across the cosmos. The worship of this dark god was not a gentle affair. While the evidence is debated among historians, both archaeological finds and ancient texts point to a grim reality. Human sacrifices were likely made to Odin. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote of sacrifices in Germanic groves. Later, Adam of Bremen described a great temple at Uppsala in Sweden, where men and animals were said to be hanged from the trees of a sacred grove as offerings to the gods. Odin, the god of the hanged, would have been the primary recipient of such a terrible tribute. His role was not to comfort, but to choose. As a psychopomp, a guide for the dead, he was not a gentle ferryman. He was a collector of souls. He actively claimed the slain for his own purposes, sorting the dead according to their usefulness for his final war. He was not a shepherd for his people. He was a general, and they were his soldiers, in life and in death. If Odin and the Gear represented a fragile, often ruthless form of order, their very existence was defined by the eternal enemy that lay just beyond the firelight, the shadow of the Jitnir. In the Norse cosmos, the gods were not unopposed. They lived under a constant existential threat. This threat came from the Jitnir. We often translate this word as giants, and this conjures images of clumsy, simple-minded brutes. This translation fails to capture their true nature. The Jitnir were not just big people. They were the raw, untamable, and chaotic forces of the natural world. They were the embodiment of everything that threatened the fragile order of gods and men. Their origins were far older than the gods themselves. They were the first beings, born from the flesh of the primordial giant, Ymir. When Odin and his brothers killed Ymir, they created the world from his body, but some of his descendants survived. This means the conflict between the gods and the Gitnir was not a simple battle of good versus evil. It was a bitter family feud, born from the very act of creation. The gods were a new order, and the Jitnir were the ancient chaos they had suppressed, but could never truly destroy. The realm of the Jitnir was called Jotunheimr. It was not depicted as a kingdom of castles, but as a vast, hostile wilderness. It was a land of icy mountains, dark forests, and frozen wastes. Jotunheimr was the name the Norse gave to the terrifying, untamed world that lay just beyond their own small settlements. It was the crushing cold of the Arctic, the impassable mountain range, the deep forest where a man could vanish forever. It was the physical manifestation of all that was inhuman and hostile. A better translation for Jotun might be devourer. They represented the forces of consumption and destruction. They were the avalanche that devours a mountainside, the glacier that grinds stone to dust, the brutal winter that consumes the warmth of the world. They were forces of entropy, constantly working to undo the order that the gods had so violently created. These were not abstract ideas. They were personified in specific, terrifying figures. Surtur was a fire giant who ruled the fiery realm of Muspelheim, his flaming sword destined to burn the world at Ragnarök. He was the volcanic eruption, the forest fire that rages out of control. There was Hrisvelg, the corpse-eater, a giant in the form of a great eagle who sat at the edge of the world. The beating of his immense wings was the source of all wind. The frost giants were the most immediate threat, the bringers of the killing cold that could destroy crops and freeze the very life from a person's body. Yet, the relationship between the gods and the Jitner was deeply ambiguous. It was not one of constant, total war. The gods fought them, yes, but they also traded with them. They sought their wisdom, and they even married them. Odin's own mother was the Jotun Besla. Thor, the greatest enemy of the giants, had a son with the Jotunus Loki. The trickster god was the son of two Jitner. This constant intermingling shows that the line between order and chaos was never clear. The gods themselves carried the blood of the wilderness within them. Despite their chaotic nature, some Gitner possessed an ancient wisdom that even Odin, in his relentless quest for knowledge, desperately sought. He journeyed to Jotunheimr to consult the wise giant Vaf Runir in a battle of wits. The very well where Odin sacrificed his eye to gain wisdom was guarded by the Jotun. This suggests that the Norse people understood that knowledge could be found in the wildest, most dangerous places, and that chaos itself held ancient truths. The story of Sky perfectly illustrates this tension. She was a Jotun, a goddess of skiing, bow hunting, and the harsh beauty of the winter mountains. After her father was killed by the gods, she marched to Asgard, demanding reparations. As part of the settlement, she married the sea god Nijar, but their marriage was doomed. Nijar could not stand the cold and the howling of wolves in her mountain home, and Sky could not bear the cry of the gulls and the sound of the waves in his seaside hall. Their story personifies the eternal conflict between the unforgiving mountains and the restless sea. One of the most telling stories is that of Thor's visit to the castle of a giant king named Utgardloki. There, Thor and his companions are challenged to a series of contests, and they are humiliatingly defeated in every one. Thor fails to lift a cat from the floor. He loses a wrestling match to an old woman. He cannot drain a drinking horn in 3 gulps. Later, Utgardloki reveals it was all an illusion. The cat was the world serpent, Jarmungandr. The old woman was old age itself, whom no one can defeat. And the drinking horn was connected to the ocean, which he could never drain. The story shows that the power of the Jitner was the power of natural law itself, a force the gods could not overcome with mere strength. Ultimately, the Gitner were the instruments of the gods' destruction. The prophecies of Ragnarök foretold a final battle where the forces of chaos would break free. The great wolf Fenrir, a child of Loki and a giantess, would swallow Odin whole. The world serpent, Jarmungandr, would poison Thor. The fire giant Surtur would engulf the world in flames. The Jitner were destined to be the end of everything. And in this, we find their true purpose. Without the constant threat of the Jitner, the gods have no purpose. The struggle against chaos is what defines their existence. It is what gives meaning to Thor's strength and to Odin's relentless search for knowledge. The Jitner were a necessary opposition. They were the shadow that gave the gods light its shape and its desperation. The world was a battleground between divine order and natural chaos, but the gods themselves were far from perfect. Their own halls filled with strife and secrets that mirrored the struggles of the mortals below. The Norse world was one defined by fear and a fragile faith. What part of their unforgiving environment do you find the most daunting? The endless sea, the brutal winter, or the dark, silent forests? Let me know in the comments below. Thor, the Thunderer. His name alone conjures an image of power. He is the defender of Midgard, the champion of humanity, the tireless enemy of the giants who would see the world plunged back into chaos. This is the god we know best, the hero, but the truth, like the sky in a gathering storm, is far more complex and far more turbulent. Thor is a protector, yes, but he is also a brute. His power is embodied by his hammer, Mjolnir. This was no ordinary weapon. It was a symbol of cosmic order. When Thor swung Mjolnir, the world was set right. Its power was not just for destruction. The hammer was also used as a tool for hallowing, for making things sacred. It was raised over weddings to bless the union, and over funeral pyres to consecrate the dead. It represented the divine force that protected the sacred boundaries of Norse life. But it was a blunt instrument, and its wielder was much the same. Thor's connection to the world of mortals was deep and personal. He was not just its protector, he was its son. His mother was Jair, the personification of the earth itself. This parentage made him the natural champion of Midgard. He felt its struggles in his very bones. His strength was the strength of the mountains, his fury the fury of the storm. He was a god of the earth, not of the ethereal sky. Even his means of transport spoke to his raw, elemental nature. He rode in a chariot pulled not by majestic horses, but by 2 goats. Their names were Tangrisnir and Snarltooth and Toothgrinder. These were no ordinary animals. They were a source of sustenance. At the end of a long day's journey, Thor could kill and cook his goats for a meal. Then, by gathering their bones and blessing them with Mjolnir, he could resurrect them, whole and unharmed, the next morning. It is a story of magical abundance, but also one of casual, brutish power. This reliance on brute force was Thor's greatest weakness. He was a god of immense strength, but very little subtlety. This was a flaw his enemies were often happy to exploit. In one famous tale, the giant Rhymer managed to steal the mighty Mjolnir. His price for its return was the hand of the goddess Freya in marriage. Thor was ready to storm the giant's fortress, but he was powerless. The gods, led by the cunning Loki, devised a different plan. Thor would have to go in disguise as Freya herself. Imagine the scene: the mighty thunderer, his great muscles and red beard stuffed into a wedding dress, a veil hiding his furious eyes. Loki went with him, disguised as a bridesmaid. At the wedding feast, Thor's immense appetite nearly gave him away. He ate an entire ox and drank 3 barrels of mead. Loki had to explain that Freya's hunger was due to her long and eager fast for the wedding. When Rhymer, blinded by his desire, brought forth the hammer to hallow the marriage, Thor seized his chance. He grabbed Mjolnir, tore off his veil, and slaughtered every giant in the hall. He recovered his hammer, but only through immense humiliation. On another journey, Thor's power was tested not by strength, but by illusion. He and his companions took shelter in what they thought was a vast hall. The next morning, they discovered it was merely the glove of an enormous giant named Skrimir. As they traveled together, the giant, who was the master of illusion, Utgarka Loki, in disguise, taunted Thor. Enraged, Thor struck the sleeping giant 3 times with Mjolnir with all his divine might. Each time, the giant simply stirred, asking if a leaf had fallen on him. Thor's greatest power was rendered useless, not by a greater force, but by a trick of the mind. Even when he was victorious, his battles left their mark. In a famous duel, he faced the giant Ragnar, the strongest of the Jitnir. Ragnar wielded a massive whetstone as a weapon. Thor threw Mjolnir, which shattered the whetstone in midair and crushed the giant's skull. But a piece of the shattered stone flew into Thor's own forehead, lodging itself deep within. The wound could never be fully healed. It remained a permanent reminder that every conflict carries a cost, that even the god of strength can be wounded. His violence was often unthinking. After the gods tricked a giant master builder into constructing the walls of Asgard, they refused to pay the agreed price, which was the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freya. The giant, enraged at the deception, revealed his true nature. The gods, terrified, called for Thor. He arrived in a thunderous rage, and without a moment's hesitation, killed the giant with a single blow of his hammer. He enforced the god's will, but he did so with deadly, unquestioning finality. This straightforward, forceful nature made him incredibly popular among the common people of the Norse world. While chieftains and kings might favor the cunning, aristocratic Odin, the average farmer or warrior looked to Thor. He was their god. He understood the struggle for survival. His hammer amulets are one of the most common artifacts found from the Viking Age, a symbol of protection against the chaos of the world. He was relatable in his anger and his simple, direct approach to problems. As the enforcer of the god's will, it was Thor who was tasked with the grim duty of punishing Loki after his ultimate crime. It was Thor who captured the trickster. It was Thor who dragged him to the cave, and it was Thor who physically bound him with the entrails of his own murdered son. He was the strong arm of divine justice, carrying out the sentence without flinching. His was the power to hold chaos at bay, even when that chaos had once walked among them as a friend. Ultimately, Thor represents a specific kind of order. It is the order of strength, of clear lines between friend and foe, of problems solved with a decisive blow, but it is an order that lacks foresight and wisdom. He is the protector, but his rage can be just as destructive as the giants he fights. He is the strong arm of the gods, but an arm without a cunning mind to guide it is simply a weapon. While Thor's power was direct and physical, the goddesses of Asgard wielded a different kind of influence, one rooted in magic, desire, and profound sacrifice. None more so than the beautiful and formidable Freya. Freya the Lady, the most beautiful of the goddesses. She is known as a goddess of love, of beauty, of fertility. But to see her only in this light is to see only the sun on the surface of a deep and mysterious ocean. Freya was a figure of immense power, a mistress of a dark and potent magic, a goddess of war, and a woman who understood that desire was one of the most powerful forces in the cosmos. Her story is one of enchantment, but also of danger. Freya was not originally one of the Geir, the family of gods that included Odin and Thor. She was of the Vanir, an older race of deities, tied to the earth, to fertility, and to a very different kind of magic. After a great war between the two tribes of gods, Freya came to live in Asgard as a hostage. But she brought with her a power that the Geir both craved and feared. She was the mistress of Seer, and it was she who taught this art to Odin himself. Seer was a form of magic unlike any other. It was a shamanistic practice, deeply connected to the spinning of fate. A practitioner of Seer would enter a trance state, often with the help of chants and intoxicating herbs. In this state, their spirit could travel, they could divine the future, or even attempt to shape it, to weave a new destiny for a person or a community. But this magic came with a dark reputation. In the deeply patriarchal Norse world, it was considered ergi, a term meaning unmanly or shameful, for a man to practice. By learning Seer from Freya, Odin was transgressing one of the deepest taboos of his culture, all in his thirst for power. Freya's own morality was complex and often shocking, The most famous story about her concerns her most prized possession, the necklace known as a masterpiece of unmatched beauty, forged by 4 dwarves. When Freya saw it, she was overcome with desire. She offered them gold and silver, but the dwarves wanted a different price. They would only give her the necklace if she agreed to spend 1 night with each of them. Freya, the great goddess, agreed. She used her body, her divine sexuality, as a tool to get what she wanted. And while she was a goddess of love, she was also, unequivocally, a goddess of war. She was not a demure beauty waiting to be rescued. She was a warrior who rode into battle on a golden bristled boar, named, which means battle swine. And her connection to warriors was just as profound as Odin's. It was said that of all the warriors slain in battle, Freya would get to choose her half first. They would go to live in her hall, located in the beautiful fields of Odin, and his Valhalla came second. She possessed tools of great power, which she sometimes lent to others. She owned a magical cloak made of falcon feathers. Anyone who wore it could transform into a bird and fly across the worlds. It was a tool of transformation, of freedom, of seeing things from a higher perspective. She lent it out on several occasions, most often to Loki, who used its power to get the gods out of the troubles he himself had usually caused. Her history was marked by conflict. Some sources claim that the Great War between the Geir and the Vanir was started because of her. They say she came to the Geir under the name Golveig, which means gold greed. Her obsessive love for gold corrupted the gods, who, in their rage, seized her. They stabbed her with spears and threw her into a fire. They did this 3 times, and 3 times she was reborn from the ashes, more beautiful and more powerful than before. She was the force of desire that could not be destroyed. Yet, for all her power and fierce independence, the myths also show a softer, more mournful side. Freya had a husband named Opiar. He was a mysterious figure who would often wander far away, leaving her alone. In his absence, Freya would weep, and her tears were not of water, but of pure red gold. She would travel the worlds searching for him, her profound sorrow a stark contrast to her fearsome reputation as a warrior and sorceress. Her beauty and power made her the ultimate object of desire. A recurring theme in the myths is the giants' relentless attempts to capture her. They saw her as the ultimate prize. To possess Freya would be to possess the fertility, prosperity, and magic of the gods. Asgard, without Freya, would be a barren and joyless place. The gods' constant, desperate defense of her shows how central she was to their very existence. In Norse society, there were women known as the Valva, or seeresses. These were respected and often feared figures who practiced a form of seer and could see the future. Freya was the archetypal Valva, the original seeress. She represented this unique source of female power in a world dominated by male warriors, a power that was not of the sword but of the spirit. Her connection to death was profound. Her realm, the field of the people, stands as a mysterious alternative to Valhalla. While Odin's hall was a barracks for an eternal army, the nature of Freya's afterlife is less clear. It may have been a place of peace, a reward in itself, not just a preparation for a future war. She was a goddess who held power over love, war, magic, and death itself. Freya's power was in shaping fate, but another god embodied the cost of upholding it. His story is one of ultimate sacrifice, a grim testament to the nature of oaths in the Norse world. Long before Odin became the Allfather, another god may have held the title of king. His name was Thor, and his story is one of honor, of law, and of a sacrifice so profound it speaks to the very core of the Norse worldview. He is the one-handed god, and the story of how he lost his hand reveals everything about the terrifying and unbreakable power of a sworn oath. Tyr is one of the most ancient gods in the pantheon. His name is directly related to the names of other chief sky gods in other Indo-European cultures, like Zeus of the Greeks and Jupiter of the Romans. This tells us that he was once a principal deity, a god of the sky, of law, and of justice. But over time, the cult of the cunning war god Odin grew, and Thor's prominence began to fade. Yet, he retained his role as the bravest and most honorable of the gods. His story is forever linked to the fate of a monster. The gods knew that Loki's monstrous children were a threat. The greatest of these was the wolf, Fenrir. Prophecies foretold that he would one day cause immense destruction. So, the gods decided they had to bind him. They brought the wolf to Asgard and raised him among them, but only Tyr was brave enough to feed the growing beast. Twice, the gods forged mighty fetters of iron to chain the wolf, and twice Fenrir shattered them with contemptuous ease. Fearing what the wolf would become, the gods sent a messenger to the dwarves, the master craftsmen of the cosmos. They asked them to forge a chain that Fenrir could not break. The dwarves created Gleipnir. It looked like a silken ribbon, soft and thin, but it was made from 6 impossible things: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. Because it was made of things that do not exist, it could not be broken. The gods took this silken ribbon to Fenrir and challenged him to break it, claiming it was stronger than it looked. But the wolf was no fool. He had grown suspicious of their games. He sensed a trick. He agreed to let them put the fetter on him, but only under one condition. As a pledge of good faith, a guarantee that they would release him if he could not break the chain. One of them had to place their hand in his mouth. A terrified silence fell over the gods. They looked at each other, each unwilling to make such a sacrifice. They knew it was a trick. They had no intention of ever releasing the wolf. To place a hand in his mouth was to lose it. In that moment of cowardice and dishonor, only one god stepped forward, Tyr, the god of justice, the bravest of them all. Without hesitation, he placed his right hand between the great, wet teeth of the monstrous wolf. The other gods quickly wrapped Gleipnir around Fenrir's legs. The wolf strained and struggled, but the more he fought, the tighter the impossible ribbon became. When Fenrir realized he was bound and tricked, he did the only thing he could. He closed his jaws. The sound of bone snapping echoed in the silence. Thor did not cry out. He stood, stoic and bleeding, having paid the price for the security of the gods. But that security was bought with a broken oath, an act of perjury committed for the greater good. This act forever defined Tyr, but it also cemented his role as the god of law and legal assemblies. The Norse people held their legal courts, called the Thing, in the open air. Here, free men would gather to settle disputes, create laws, and pass judgment. Tyr was the patron of this institution. He who had sacrificed his own body in the name of a binding agreement understood the supreme importance of law and order in a chaotic world. Even a god of justice has his fate. Thor is destined to fight at Ragnarök. His final opponent will be Garmr, the monstrous guard dog of the underworld. Hell, they will kill each other in the final moments of the world. A mutual destruction that sees the god of law fall to the hound of death. His story is a powerful metaphor for the Norse concept of justice. It teaches that order is not always pure or gentle. Sometimes, to preserve the world, painful sacrifices must be made. Sometimes, laws must be bent, and oaths must be broken. The fading prominence of Tyr tells a story in itself. The fact that his worship was largely supplanted by that of Odin is telling. It may reflect a shift in the values of the Viking Age, a move away from the god of solemn law and order, and towards the god of cunning, of ecstasy, of war, and of questionable morality, the god who would sacrifice anything and anyone for power. Tyr's sacrifice was a noble lie, an oath broken to preserve order. But there was another in Asgard, one born of chaos, who saw the hypocrisy in the god's actions. His purpose was to expose every lie, creating the wound in the world that would never heal. Loki. There is no figure in the Norse pantheon more complex, more contradictory, or more consequential. He is not a god in the same way as the others. He is not a demon to be despised. He is something far more interesting, a catalyst, an agent of change, the wound in the world. To understand Loki is to understand the deep, tragic flaw that lies at the very heart of Asgard. His otherness is the key to his character. Loki was not one of the Geir by birth. He was the son of Tujitnir, born of the very chaos the gods sought to control. Yet, in his youth, he had sworn an oath of blood brotherhood with Odin himself. This pact gave him a place in Asgard, but it did not make him one of them. He was the eternal outsider, the foster child, sitting at the feast, watching with clever, resentful eyes. This position, both inside and outside the halls of power, gave him a unique and dangerous perspective. His nature was like fire. It could provide warmth and light, or it could burn everything to the ground. He was a trickster, and his cleverness often solved problems for the gods. But these were almost always problems he had created in the first place. When he mischievously cut off the beautiful golden hair of Thor's wife, Sif, he was forced to travel to the dwarves to have them craft an even more beautiful replacement. While there, he also acquired a treasure trove of other magical items for the gods, including Odin's spear and Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. He brought them gifts, but only after committing an offense. Loki's outsider status extended to his children. While he had sons with his Asgardian wife, his most famous offspring were born of his union with the giantess Angrboda, the bringer of grief. He fathered 3 monstrous and powerful beings with her. The first was Hel, the half-dead, half-living goddess, who was given dominion over the underworld of the dead. The second was Jarmungandr, the world serpent, and the third was the great wolf, Fenrir. These 3 children were the key agents of the gods' prophesied destruction. Loki literally fathered the end of the world. He was a master shapeshifter, unbound by form or even gender. His transformations were not just tricks, they were fundamental changes to his being. When the gods needed to stop a giant builder from completing his work on time, Loki transformed himself into a beautiful mare. He lured away the giant's magical stallion, Svalfari, ensuring the giant failed his contract. Later, Loki, still in the form of a mare, gave birth to an 8-legged horse. This was Sleipnir, who would become Odin's own steed. Loki was not just a father of monsters, but also the mother of a god's mount. His bitterness and resentment grew over time. It culminated in a single venomous event described in a poem called the Lokasena, or Loki's Quarrel. At a great feast held by the sea giant, J.R. Loki was denied entry. He forced his way in and proceeded to systematically insult and lay bare the secret shames of every single god and goddess in the hall. He accused them of cowardice, of infidelity, of hypocrisy. He exposed their deepest secrets, using the truth as his weapon. He was the voice of uncomfortable reality in a hall built on fragile pride. The driving force behind his malice was envy. He envied the gods' power, their beauty, and their camaraderie. Most of all, he envied the god Balder. Balder was the most beloved of the gods. He was perfect, pure, and beautiful, and everyone loved him. Everyone except Loki. Loki's jealousy of Balder's perfection would curdle into a hatred so profound it would break the world. His engineering of Balder's death was his ultimate crime. It was the point of no return, the act that transformed him from a tolerated, if difficult, member of the community into their greatest and most hated enemy. This single act was the catalyst that set in motion the final, irreversible chain of events leading to Ragnarök. He did not just kill a god, he killed the god's hope. For this crime, his punishment was one of unimaginable cruelty. The gods captured him and 2 of his sons. They transformed one son into a wolf, who then tore his own brother to pieces. The gods then used the dead boy's entrails to bind Loki to 3 sharp rocks inside a dark cave. As a final act of torture, they placed a giant serpent on the rock above him, where it would drip burning venom onto his face for all eternity. It was a punishment designed to inflict endless agony, a reflection of the endless grief he had caused. It is easy to see Loki as a villain, but in the Norse worldview, he was something more. He was a necessary evil. Without his chaos, his tricks, and his crimes, the world of the gods would be static. There would be no change, no progress, no story. Loki is the force that introduces consequence. He is the one who drives the narrative forward towards its tragic, inevitable conclusion. He is not a devil in the Christian sense. He is not a representation of pure evil. He is a force of chaos and fate, an outsider fulfilling a prescribed role that is just as necessary to the cosmos as the fragile order of the gods. Loki's envy and the gods' hypocrisy planted a seed of darkness that would soon bloom into tragedy. The first fruit of that poison was an event so grievous it broke the world. The death of the one god they all thought was untouchable. The gods of Asgard were as flawed and conflicted as any mortal. Which of these deities do you find the most compelling in their imperfection? The brute strength of Thor, the dark magic of Freya, the solemn sacrifice of Tyr, or the bitter chaos of Loki? Share your thoughts below. In the heart of Asgard, there was light, and that light was Balder, son of Odin and Frigg. He was the god of beauty, of purity, of joy itself. He was so fair that light was said to shine from him. His presence was a balm, a guarantee of peace. But in a world governed by a fatalistic destiny, even the purest light must cast a shadow. Baldra's story is not one of triumph. It is the story of a love that tried to defy fate, and in doing so, brought about the very doom it sought to prevent. It began with dreams. Balder, the Shining One, was plagued by nightmares, dark, foreboding visions of his own death. A cloud of anxiety fell over all of Asgard. The gods, who had faced down giants and monsters, were terrified by a dream. for they knew that dreams were often whispers of a fate already woven. At the heart of this fear was Baldur's mother, the goddess Frigg. Her love for her son was as vast and as powerful as the cosmos itself. She would not stand by and let fate take him. And so, Frigg embarked on an impossible quest. She traveled through all the 9 worlds, her heart filled with a mother's desperate resolve. She spoke to every single thing in creation. She extracted a solemn oath from fire that it would not burn her son. She took a vow from water that it would not drown him. She spoke to iron and all other metals, to stones and earth, to trees and all plants, to diseases and poisons, to animals great and small. Everything swore the oath. Nothing would harm the beloved Baldur. But in her desperate, sweeping journey, she made one small oversight. She saw a tiny plant growing on an oak tree, a sprig of mistletoe. It seemed so young, so small, so utterly harmless. She thought it was too insignificant to bother asking for an oath. It was a tiny exception in a world of promises, a fatal oversight, a single loose thread in the tapestry of her protection. With the oaths secured, the gods' anxiety turned to joyous celebration. Baldur was invincible. To amuse themselves, they created a new game. They would gather and stand Baldur in their midst. Then they would hurl things at him: axes, swords, stones, spears. It was a marvelous sight. The weapons would fly towards him, only to swerve away at the last moment, or fall harmlessly to the ground. Baldur stood, smiling, in a storm of redirected violence, and the gods laughed, their relief echoing through the golden halls. But one being did not laugh. Loki watched the game, and his envy curdled into a cold, calculated malice. He saw the gods' joy, and he saw a hypocrisy he could exploit. He disguised himself as an old woman and went to visit Frigg in her hall. With clever, prying questions and false praise, he coaxed the story of the oaths from the proud mother. He asked if she was truly certain she had asked everything. Frigg, in her moment of triumph, confessed her one small omission, the harmless little mistletoe. That was all Loki needed. He slipped away, his mind already spinning its dark design. He found the mistletoe, and from its soft, pliable wood, he fashioned a small, sharp dart. He then returned to the gods' game. He saw the blind god H.R. Baldur's own brother, standing at the edge of the circle, unable to participate. Loki approached him, his voice full of false sympathy. "Why don't you honor your brother?" he asked. "I cannot see to aim," H.R. replied. Loki placed the mistletoe dart in his hand. "I will guide you," he whispered. H.R., trusting and eager to join the celebration, took aim as Loki guided his hand. He threw the small dart. It flew, silent and true. Unlike the axe or the sword, it did not swerve. It struck Baldur. The god of light did not cry out. He simply fell. And a silence, profound and horrified, fell over the gods. The laughter died in their throats. This was not a wound that could be healed. This was not a battle. This was the first true death in Asgard. A crime so grievous it could not be paid for with gold or settled with oaths. The joy had been murdered. The grief of the gods was a physical thing, a crushing weight that stole their breath. But Frigg's sorrow was an ocean. After the initial shock, a plan was formed. The god Ar, called the Bold, volunteered for a desperate mission. He mounted Odin's 8-legged steed, Sleipnir, and began the 9-night ride to the underworld. He would go to the halls of the goddess Hel and plead for Baldur's return. or rode through dark valleys until he reached the gates of the underworld. He met with Hel, the grim daughter of Loki, and begged for his brother's release. Hel, in her cold and calculating way, saw an opportunity. She would agree to release Balder, but only on one condition. It must be proven that he was as beloved as everyone claimed. Everything in the world, living and dead, must weep for him. If a single thing refused, Balder would remain with her forever. Messengers were sent across all the worlds, and everything wept. The gods and the people wept. The animals wept. The trees wept tears of sap, and the stones wept tears of dew. The very earth itself shed tears for the loss of its light. The proof was almost complete. But the messengers found one last creature, an old giantess sitting in a cave. Her name was Ducky K. They asked her to weep for Balder. She refused. "Let Hel hold what she has," she sneered. It was Loki, in one last, spiteful disguise. The condition was broken. Balder's fate was sealed. With Balder gone and Loki punished, the joy in Asgard died. The bonds of kinship that held the worlds together began to fray. A cold, unlike any other, began to creep across the land. The world was now entering Fimbulwinter, the long dark before the end. Fimbulwinter, the mighty winter. This was the name the prophecy gave to the beginning of the end. It was not a season. It was an age, a death rattle of the world. After the light of Balder was extinguished, the warmth of the world began to die with him. For 3 years there would be no summer, 3 unbroken winters, back to back, with no season of green, no time of thaw, no moment of relief. The world was now in its death throes. Imagine the cold, not the crisp, clean cold of a winter morning, but a relentless, biting, life-stealing cold that penetrated every layer of clothing, every wall of the longhouse, a cold that settled deep into the bones. Snow, driven by a howling, endless wind, would blow from all directions at once. The sun, when it appeared at all, was a weak, pale ghost in a gray sky, offering no warmth. The world was being buried in ice. As the world outside froze, the world inside, the hearts of men and women, froze as well. The most sacred bond in Norse society was kinship, the love and loyalty of the JT, the family. During Fimbulwinter, this bond would shatter. The prophecies spoke of a horrifying moral collapse. Brothers would fight and kill each other over a scrap of food. Sisters, sons, a relationship of special significance, would defile their kinship. Oaths would be meaningless. Trust would vanish. It would become an age of axes, an age of swords, an age of wars. Humanity, stripped of its laws and its love, would revert to its most desperate, animalistic state. The Longhouse, once a center of community and warmth, would become a prison of suspicion and fear. Every neighbor was a potential rival. Every stranger a potential threat. The only law was the law of survival. Famine became the great tyrant. The endless winter meant no crops could grow. The deep snow meant livestock could not graze. Hunting became impossible. The people of Midgard, who had always lived on the edge of starvation, were pushed over the precipice. The gnawing, hollow ache of true hunger became a constant companion. Parents would watch their children grow weak. The old would be left to die. Despair was the only thing that was plentiful. This myth of a world-ending winter may have been rooted in a real, terrifying memory. In the year 536 AD, a massive volcanic eruption, likely in the northern hemisphere, cast a veil of dust into the atmosphere. The sun was dimmed for over a year. It led to widespread crop failures, famine, and death across the world. It is possible that the memory of this volcanic winter, passed down through generations, became the seed of the Fimbulwinter myth, a time when the sun truly did fail. The prophecy said that during this long, dark, two ancient enemies would finally achieve their goal. Since the beginning of time, two great wolves, Skull and Hati, had been relentlessly pursuing the sun and the moon across the sky. Now, in the weakness of the world, they would finally catch their prey. One would swallow the sun, and the other the moon, and the world would be plunged into a profound and absolute darkness. The chaos in the sky would be matched by the chaos on earth. Great earthquakes would rack the land. Mountains would crumble and fall. The shaking would be so violent that every bond, every chain, every fetter would be broken. Far away in his dark cave, the entrails binding Loki would snap. He would be free. At the edge of the world, the mighty serpent Jarmungandr would be roused into a terrible fury. He would thrash and rise from the depths, causing the seas to boil and rear up, flooding the dying land. For the people of Midgard, this was not a distant, divine battle. It was their lived reality. It was the feeling of the earth shaking beneath their feet. It was the terror of a sky without a sun. It was watching their families and their world freeze, starve, and tear itself apart in the darkness. Unlike other stories of the apocalypse, there was no ark to build, no savior to wait for. There was no hope of redemption. It was a period of pure, grinding attrition, a slow, agonizing end. In the final days of Fimbulwinter, a great and terrible silence would fall. The winds would cease. The fighting would stop. The world would be a frozen, dark, and silent graveyard, waiting for the final alarm. When the sun and moon are finally devoured, and the great wolf Fenrir breaks his chains, the rooster Galincum will crow in Asgard. The god Heimdallr will sound the Jallarhorn, and its blast will be heard in all the 9 worlds. The final battle has come. The sound of the Jallarhorn is a single, deafening blast. It echoes across the frozen, dark world, a sound that shakes the very roots of the mountains. It is the call to war, the final war. On the plains of Vigrir, the armies of the cosmos will muster for the last time. This is not a battle for glory or for territory. It is the final fated slaughter at the end of time. From the 54 gates of Valhalla, the great army of the Einherjar will march. 800 chosen warriors from each gate, a spectral army of the bravest dead. At their head rides Odin, the Allfather. He wears a golden helmet and wields his spear, Gun. They are marching to meet their doom, their faces grim with the knowledge of what is to come, but they march anyway. Against them comes the tide of chaos. Loki, freed from his bonds, stands at the helm of a grotesque and horrifying ship. It is Naglfar, a vessel made entirely from the uncut fingernails and toenails of the dead. It is a symbol of every neglected duty, every forgotten ritual. On its deck are the legions of the dead from Hel's realm. With them come the frost giants, and from the south the fire giant Surtur, his sword blazing brighter than the sun, leading the sons of Muspel. The battle begins. The field of Vigrir becomes a storm of violence and death. But the sagas do not focus on the clash of armies. They focus on the final, personal duels, the settling of ancient scores. Odin rides straight for his prophesied doom, the great wolf Fenrir. The wolf's jaws are so wide they stretch from the earth to the sky. The Allfather, god of wisdom, poetry, and war, fights with all his might, But fate cannot be unwritten. Fenrir lunges, and the chief of the gods is swallowed whole. A swift, brutal, and undignified end. But Odin does not go unavenged. His silent son, Ar, steps forward. He wears a special shoe, cobbled together from all the scraps of leather that shoemakers have cut from their own shoes since the beginning of time. He places this mighty shoe on the wolf's lower jaw, and with his immense strength, he grabs the upper jaw and tears the monster apart. Vengeance is swift, but it does not bring his father back. Nearby, another ancient rivalry reaches its climax. Thor, the champion of Midgard, finally faces his nemesis, the world serpent, Jormungandr. The serpent rises from the sea, spewing black poison that stains the air and sky. The thunder god and the great dragon fight a battle of cosmic proportions. Thor, with a final mighty roar, brings Mjolnir crashing down upon the serpent's head, killing it. He is victorious. But as the monster dies, it covers him in its deadly venom. Thor stumbles back. He takes 9 steps, and then he falls, dead, to the poisoned earth. Other gods meet their fates. Freyr, the noble god of fertility, charges the fire giant Surtur, but Freyr is unarmed. Long ago, he gave away his magical, self-fighting sword to win the hand of the giantess he loved. Now, at the end of the world, that act of love dooms him. He fights with a deer's antler, but it is not enough. Surtur cuts him down. Tyr, the one-handed god of law, fights the hound of hell, Garmr. They kill each other, and at last 2 old adversaries meet amidst the chaos. Heimdallr, the vigilant watchman of the gods, and Loki, the agent of chaos, the guardian of order versus the force of disruption. They fight, and their hatred for each other gives them terrible strength. They deal each other a mortal wound. They fall together, their ancient conflict ending only in their mutual death. The great combatants have fallen. The field is littered with the bodies of gods, giants, and men. It is then that Surtur, the fire giant, fulfills his destiny. He swings his flaming sword, and the fire engulfs the entire world. It burns the sky, the land, and all life. The blazing earth, blackened and burned to ash, finally sinks beneath the waves of the boiling sea. Silence falls. The world burns. The gods are dead. The 9 worlds sink back into the sea. Silence falls. But in Norse cosmology, every ending is also a beginning. From the wreckage of the old, something new stirs, a world reborn from ash. The fire is extinguished. The sea grows calm. The smoke clears. For an age, there is nothing but a quiet, dark ocean. But then, something stirs. Slowly, beautifully, a new world rises from the waves. It is not the harsh, scarred world of the past. The prophecy says it will be green, fertile, and bathed in a gentle light. Waterfalls flow, and eagles hunt for fish in their clear streams. This is the world reborn. A handful of the gods survive the fire and the flood. They were not the great, powerful gods of the old age, but their children, the second generation. Odin's sons, the quiet avenger Ar and his brother, find their way to this new land. Thor's sons, Moi and Magni, strength and courage, also survive, and they find, lying in the green grass, their father's hammer, Mjolnir. The tool of order remains. And then, a miracle. From the land of the dead, 2 figures emerge, blinking in the new light. It is Baldur the Beautiful and his blind brother, Hrjar, who was the instrument of his death. In this new world, the old crime is forgiven. the brothers are reconciled. Their return signals a new age, one free from the jealousies and conflicts that doomed the old gods. Together, the survivors make their new home on the fields of Irevalur, the very place where Asgard once stood. As they explore their new home, they come across something glinting in the grass. They are the golden game pieces, like a form of chess, that the original Gear owned at the very beginning of time. The pieces they played with in their age of innocence, before the first war, before the first broken oath. Finding them now symbolizes a chance to start the game over. A chance to, perhaps, play it better this time. And what of humanity? The old world was consumed, but to humans were said to have survived. A man and a woman, and Rosser. Their names mean life and striver after life. They hid themselves in a place called Holt, the Wood of Horde, and there they survived the fire and flood by drinking the morning dew. From this single couple, a new, and hopefully less violent, humanity will be born to repopulate the green earth. The new world will not be dark. Before the great wolf Skoll devoured the sun, she gave birth to a daughter just as beautiful as her mother. This new sun will now take her place in the sky, lighting the new world with a gentle, steady warmth. But is this new world a paradise? The poems are ambiguous. Some versions paint a picture of a pure and peaceful age. But one chilling verse in the prophecy of the seeress, adds a note of unease. It says that after the world is reborn, the dark dragon, Hggr, the malice striker, will be seen flying out from the mountains, carrying corpses in his wings. This might suggest that evil, decay, and death were not completely erased. The cycle of conflict may one day begin again. Many scholars debate whether this hopeful, almost utopian ending was part of the original pagan myths. Some believe it may show the influence of Christianity, with its promise of a new heaven and a new earth after a final judgment. It is possible that as the Norse world converted, their old story of the end began to absorb elements of the new faith. Whatever its origins, the new world is born not with a bang, but with a quiet, humble restart. The age of epic heroes, terrifying monsters, and flawed, feuding gods is over. The great drama has concluded. Life will now be simpler, quieter, a chance to begin again in a world washed clean by fire and water. And so the great cycle turns. The story of the gods, with its fire and fury, comes to its quiet, fated end. Their world, born of ice and fire, returns to silence and new life, a final, somber truth in the heart of the Norse soul. The great story is over. The gods have met their fate, and the world has been wiped clean, ready for a new, quieter beginning. This fatalistic, yet cyclical view was the bedrock of the Norse world. As you begin to drift and relax, let this sense of an ending and a new beginning soothe your mind. Thank you for listening to our main story. The tale has been told, but for those still awake, our journey continues into the echoes and scholarship of this lost world. As our main story comes to a close, our journey can continue for a little while longer. Not into the realm of myth, but into the quiet halls of history and scholarship. The tales of Odin, Thor, and Ragnarök are powerful. But how do we know them? The answers we have are themselves echoes, whispers from a world that had no books. For centuries, these stories lived only on the wind, in the shared breath of a people. They were a part of an oral tradition. Imagine a world without writing as we know it, a world where all history, all law, and all faith is held not on a page, but in the fragile and powerful vessel of human memory. This was the world of the Norse. The stories we have heard were not read, they were performed. At the heart of this tradition was the skald, the court poet. A skald was a highly respected artist, a master of words. Their poetry was not simple rhyme. It was a highly complex and technical art form, with strict rules of meter and alliteration. They used intricate poetic devices to weave their tales. One of these was the kenning, a kind of compound metaphor. The sea might be called the whale road. A battle might be a storm of swords. A warrior could be a feeder of ravens. These kennings created a rich, layered language, a language that was both beautiful and a challenge to understand for the uninitiated. This complexity meant that the poetry was not just a story, but a demonstration of the skald's immense skill and learning. The skald was a vital part of any chieftain's court. They were the entertainer, the historian, and the preserver of the clan's honor. They composed poems of praise for their patrons, and poems that recorded great deeds, and they were the keepers of the sacred stories. The earliest hints we have of this written tradition are not in books, but carved in stone. Runic inscriptions, the script of the Germanic peoples, are often very brief. They might mark a memorial stone to a fallen warrior, or claim ownership of an object, but sometimes they contain a cryptic clue, a passing reference to a god or a myth, a solid but fleeting echo of these beliefs. More vivid are the picture stones, particularly those found on the Swedish island of Gotland. These great, carved slabs of stone are like pages from a lost book. They show figures and scenes that we can recognize from the later myths. A man on an 8-legged horse is surely Odin on Sleipnir. A figure swinging a hammer is certainly Thor. These stones are precious visual proof that the stories we know from later texts were circulating hundreds of years earlier. Living in an oral tradition means that a myth is never static. There was no single correct version of the story of Thor or Loki. Each storyteller, each skald, would have their own version. They would adapt the tales for their audience, adding embellishments, shifting the focus, or weaving in local details. The myths were alive. They were constantly changing, evolving with each telling. This fluidity is something we often forget when we read them today, set in the unchanging text of a printed book. To be a keeper of this tradition required a formidable memory. Skalds and storytellers would have undergone years of training. They learned to memorize tens of thousands of lines of poetry, along with the complex rules for composing new verses. Their mind was the library of their culture. It was a skill that was highly prized and absolutely essential in a world without widespread writing. The context for these performances is important. Picture a longhouse in the depths of a Scandinavian winter. The world outside is frozen and dark, but inside, a great fire burns in a central hearth. Its light casts long, flickering shadows on the walls. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. The chieftain and his people are gathered, their faces lit by the flames, their attention fixed on the storyteller. His deep, resonant voice chants the ancient verses in Old Norse. For these listeners, this was not just a story. It was their history, their faith, and their connection to the world of the gods. Much later, in the 13th century, many of these oral poems were finally collected and written down in Iceland. This collection is known as the Poetic Edda, or the Elder Edda. It is a collection of anonymous poems, and it is our most direct and important source for the myths. It contains great works like the prophecy of the Seers, which outlines the entire cosmic story from creation to Ragnarök. It also contains the Havamal, the sayings of the High One, a collection of proverbs and wisdom attributed to Odin himself. But we must always remember that what we have is just a tiny, precious fragment. It is the faintest echo of what must have been a vast and rich oral world. For every story that was written down, countless others were simply forgotten. They faded with the memories of the last people who told them. They are whispers on the wind, lost forever to the silence of the past. These spoken whispers were finally captured and written down, but often centuries after the Viking Age had ended, and by men of a new faith. The most important of these was a Christian scholar from Iceland. The story of how these pagan myths survived into the modern age is largely the story of one man. His name was Snorri Sturluson. He was not a pagan priest or a Viking skald. He was a wealthy and powerful Icelandic chieftain, a politician, a poet, and a Christian scholar who lived in the 13th century, long after the conversion of Scandinavia. It is thanks to his work that we have a coherent narrative of Norse mythology at all. Snorri lived from 1179 to 1241. He was a complex and ambitious figure, deeply involved in the turbulent politics of his time. But he was also a man with a deep and abiding love for the old poetry of his ancestors. He saw that the art of the skalds was dying out. Younger poets no longer understood the complex kennings and mythological allusions. So, around the year 1220, he wrote a book. We now call it the Prose Edda, or the Younger Edda. His goal was to create a handbook for poets, a guide to the old myths, so that this great cultural inheritance would not be lost. But Snorri had a problem. He was a Christian, writing in a Christian society. How could he write about pagan gods without being accused of heresy? He used a clever intellectual tool that was common in the Middle Ages, called euth. In the prologue to his Edda, Snorri presents a rational explanation for the old gods. He claims they were not gods at all, but great human heroes, kings and magicians who had migrated from the ancient city of Troy. Over time, he argued, ignorant people forgot they were merely men and began to worship them as deities. This frame allowed him to explore the myths in great detail, while maintaining that he was simply writing about history. The Prose Edda is divided into several parts. The most important for us is the first, the Gylfaginning, or the deluding of Gylfi. In this section, Snorri creates another narrative frame. He tells the story of a mythical Swedish king named Gylfi, who travels in disguise to Asgard. There, he questions three figures who are Odin and his brothers in disguise. Gylfi asks about the creation of the world, the nature of the gods, and their ultimate fate. In answering his questions, the gods lay out the entire mythology in a systematic, narrative form. It is from Snorri's Gylfaginning that we get most of the stories as we know them. The poetic Edda is often cryptic, fragmented, and elusive. Snorri took those poetic sources and wove them into a coherent prose narrative. He connected the dots, explained the relationships, and gave the myths the shape they have in our popular imagination today. Without Snorri, we would have the beautiful poems, but we would be missing much of the story that connects them. This leads us to the great scholarly question: how much of Snorri's work is a faithful recording of old beliefs, and how much is his own invention? Did he alter stories to make them fit his Christian worldview? Did he organize them in a way that the original pagans would not have recognized? Did he leave things out that he found distasteful? The answer is that he almost certainly did all of these things. He was a literary artist, not a modern anthropologist. He was shaping the material for his own purposes. Because of this, scholars must always be cautious. They compare Snorri's prose accounts with the older, more difficult poetry of the Poetic Edda, looking for discrepancies. Other, more fragmented sources exist as well. A Danish historian named Saxo Grammaticus wrote a history of the Danes that includes heavily euhemerized versions of the myths. But even with these other sources, Snorri's work is indispensable. Despite his biases, Snorri was a brilliant preserver of culture. It is not an exaggeration to say that without his intellectual curiosity, without the quiet scratching of his quill pen on parchment in a study in medieval Iceland, our knowledge of this rich mythological world would be a shadow of what it is today. His work is not a perfect photograph of the past. It is a window framed by his own time, his own faith, and his own literary genius. But it is the clearest window we have. While texts give us the stories, the soil itself sometimes offers faint, tangible traces of this ancient faith in the form of sacred sites and the remnants of ritual. To find the faith of the Norse people, we must look not only to ancient texts, but also to the landscape itself. Their religion was not one of grand, stone temples, like those of the Greeks or Romans. It was a faith deeply tied to the natural world. Their most sacred places were not built, but found. They were groves of ancient trees, prominent hills, or large, unusual rocks. Worship, for the most part, was conducted under the open sky. Ancient writers, like the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote about the Germanic tribes long before the Viking Age, described their worship in sacred groves. Later, the medieval chronicler Adam of Bremen wrote of a great grove at Uppsala in Sweden. He claimed that every tree in that wood was considered divine. It was here, he wrote, that sacrifices of both animals and humans were made, their bodies left hanging from the branches as offerings to the gods. It is a grim image, but it speaks to a deep reverence for these natural, sacred spaces. The archaeology of Scandinavia reveals other forms of ritual. For thousands of years, long before and during the Viking Age, people deposited offerings in the wetlands, in bogs and marshes. These were seen as liminal places, gateways between the world of humans and other, more mysterious realms. Tools, beautifully crafted weapons, and jewelry were intentionally broken and placed in the water as gifts to the gods. Sometimes, even human bodies were placed in the bogs. Their remarkable preservation giving us a haunting glimpse into these ancient rites. The idea of a Norse temple is a complex one. Adam of Bremen describes a magnificent temple at Gamla Uppsala, a great building covered in gold, containing statues of Thor, Odin, and Frey. While archaeological work has confirmed that this was a major site of ritual and burial for centuries, no definitive proof of such a grand temple has ever been found. It is possible Adam was exaggerating or applying his own Christian ideas of a church to a pagan site. The Old Norse language had words for holy sites. A hergar seems to have been a stone altar, a pile of rocks, likely outdoors, where rituals were performed. A hof was a building. However, it is now thought that a hof was not a dedicated public temple. It was most likely a chieftain's great hall, a building that was simply repurposed for religious feasts and rituals when the need arose. Faith was integrated into the home and the community. Perhaps the most dramatic archaeological evidence comes from their burial practices. The great ship burials, like those found at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, are stunning testaments to their beliefs about the afterlife. High-status men and women were laid to rest in actual, seaworthy longships, which were then buried under enormous mounds of earth. The ship was the vessel for the final journey. They were buried with everything they might need in the next world: weapons, tools, kitchen utensils, and immense personal wealth. These grave goods tell a story. Sacrificed animals, like horses and dogs, were included to serve their masters in the afterlife. In some high-status female graves, it appears that female thralls, or slaves, were sacrificed to accompany their mistress. It is a dark practice, but it reveals a powerful belief in a tangible afterlife, one that mirrored the social structures of the living world. The central ritual of their faith was the which means sacrifice. This was not a somber, private prayer. It was a joyous, communal feast. An animal would be sacrificed. Its blood would be collected and sprinkled on the altar and on the participants, as a way of sharing in its sacred life force. Then, the meat would be cooked in great cauldrons over a fire, and the entire community would share in the feast. It was a way of honoring the gods and strengthening the bonds of the community at the same time. We also find evidence of small personal acts of faith. Thousands of tiny amulets, most often in the shape of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, have been found all across the Viking world. These were worn for personal protection, a silent prayer against the chaos of the world. Eventually, this world of sacred groves and sacrificial feasts began to fade. The transition to Christianity was a slow process, one we can see in the soil. Often the very first churches were built directly on top of older pagan holy sites. It was a deliberate act of claiming the sanctity of the landscape for a new god. This faith, so tied to the landscape of the north, did not simply vanish. It faded, but its stories proved incredibly resilient, leaving a legacy that would echo through the centuries, long after the last was held. The old gods fell silent. The sacred groves were cut down. The world of the Vikings ended. But their stories did not die. They went dormant, like seeds buried in frozen ground, waiting for a new season to bloom. The legacy of these dark, powerful myths is a long and complicated one, a journey of rediscovery, reimagining, and sometimes profound misunderstanding. After the conversion to Christianity, the myths lived on in a changed form within the great Icelandic sagas. These prose histories, written in the 13th and 14th centuries, tell the stories of the great families who settled Iceland. While they are ostensibly historical, they are filled with the heroic ethics, the fatalism, and the occasional ghostly remnants of the pagan world. For several centuries, the original myths were largely forgotten outside of Iceland. Then, beginning in the 17th century, scholars in Scandinavia began to rediscover these old texts. It was a source of national pride, a connection to a glorious pre-Christian past. But the Great Revival came in the 19th century with the rise of the Romantic movement. Artists, writers, and thinkers across Europe, particularly in Germany and Britain, became fascinated with Norse mythology. They saw it as a powerful, primal, and passionate alternative to the cool, rational world of Greco-Roman classicism. The most famous product of this revival is Richard Wagner's monumental opera cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen, The Ring of the Nibelung. While it is loosely based on Norse sagas, Wagner heavily reinterpreted the stories through the lens of 19th-century German philosophy and his own political ideas. His powerful, swelling music came to define the sound of myth for generations to come. In Britain, artists and writers like William Morris were also captivated. They translated many of the sagas, their work influencing a new generation. One young reader who fell in love with these translations was a student who would later become a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford. His name was J.R.R. Tolkien. His own mythology, the vast legendarium of Middle-earth, is profoundly indebted to the Norse world. The structure of his cosmos, the nature of his elves and dwarves, and many names, like Gandalf, are drawn directly from Norse sources. The Lord of the Rings is, in many ways, a modern echo of these ancient tales. But this legacy has a darker side. In the 20th century, Nazi Germany misappropriated Norse symbols and ideals for their own abhorrent ideology. They twisted the runes and the idea of a heroic Germanic past to serve their racist and violent political project. This capoption left a deep and painful stain on these ancient symbols, one that continues to be fought against to this day. In more recent times, the gods have been reborn in unexpected ways. Since the 1970s, a modern pagan religious movement, known as asatru or heathenry, has sought to revive the worship of the Old Norse gods as a living faith. And, of course, the myths have found a new, global audience through the world of comic books and films. The characters of Thor, Loki, and Odin, as presented by Marvel Comics, have become household names. These versions are very different from their mythological originals, but they have brought the ancient names, if not the original spirit, to millions. So why do these stories endure? Why do these tales, born of a harsh, cold world over 1,000 years ago, still have the power to fascinate us? Perhaps it is because of their profound psychological depth. They grapple with the timeless questions of human existence, the struggle against a chaotic world, the seductive nature of power, the inescapable reality of fate, and the quiet, profound courage it takes to face a known doom. They do not offer easy answers or comforting promises. Instead, they offer a stark and beautiful vision of a world where the only true victory is to face the end with your eyes open. The echoes of these ancient gods are all around us, in names, in stories, and in the timeless human need to explain a vast and intimidating world. They are a testament to a faith carved from a harsh land, a faith that stared into the abyss of a fated doom and chose to meet it with courage. As you continue to relax, let these echoes fade into the quiet of the night. F1. And so, we drift into the final echoes of this ancient world. There is no more story to tell, no great battle to be fought. There is only the quiet contemplation of the mysteries that the Norse people left behind, carved in stone and wood. Among the most potent of these mysteries are the runes. They were more than just an alphabet. They were symbols of cosmic power. The oldest form of the runes is known to scholars as the Elder Futhark. It is an alphabet of 24 characters, a system of writing used for centuries, from roughly the year 150 to 800. Each rune had a name and a sound, but it also had a deeper meaning, a power. By the time of the Viking Age, this system had been simplified. A new alphabet, the younger Futhark, used only 16 characters to write the Old Norse language. These were the symbols used to carve the great memorial stones. The myths tell us that these symbols were not an invention of mortals. They were a discovery, a prize, won through immense sacrifice. In the poem called the Havamal, Odin describes his ordeal. He tells how he hung from the great world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights. He was wounded with his own spear. He was offered no food, no water. He hung there, in a state between life and death, peering into the deepest mysteries of the cosmos. On the 9th night, with a great cry, he seized the runes. He fell from the tree, having won this profound and secret knowledge at a terrible cost. The very word, rune, tells us of its nature. It comes from a word that means secret or mystery. To the Norse mind, these were not just letters. To carve a rune was to invoke the power that it represented. Each symbol was a container for a cosmic concept. Let us gently consider just a few. The first rune of the Elder Futhark is Fehu. Its sound is F, its shape is like the horns of a cow, and its meaning is cattle or wealth. In this ancient world, wealth was not gold, but livestock. Fehu is the rune of prosperity, of abundance, of the nourishment that sustains life. It is the power of simple, earthy well-being. The second rune is Uruz. Its sound is a U. Its shape is a strong, simple arch. Its meaning is the aurochs, the great wild ox that once roamed the forests of Europe. This was a creature of immense and untamable power. Uruz is the rune of primal strength, of vitality, of courage and endurance. It is the untamed energy of the natural world. Another rune is Thuris's. Its sound is the sound. Its shape is a sharp, pointed thorn. Its meaning is the giant or the thorn itself. It represents a chaotic, destructive force. But it can also represent defense, the sharp point that protects. Thuris's is the rune of conflict, of the untamed powers of chaos that exist both outside and inside of us. And another still is Ansu's. Its sound is A, its shape is an open, vertical form. Its meaning is the Jir, the gods themselves. This is the rune of divine wisdom, of communication, of inspiration and poetry. It is the breath of Odin, the sacred words that carry knowledge and understanding. Long before the Viking Age, the Roman historian Tacitus described a curious practice of the Germanic tribes. He wrote that they would cut a branch from a fruit-bearing tree and slice it into slips. They would mark these slips with signs and then cast them onto a white cloth. A priest would then interpret the signs. This may have been a precursor to the practice of rune casting, a form of divination used to seek guidance from the hidden forces of the world. The runes we have found from the past are rarely used for long letters or books. Writing was a specialized, almost magical act. They were carved into great standing stones to memorialize the dead, their angular shapes perfect for cutting into stone. They were carved on pieces of wood or bone to create magical charms. They were etched onto swords and spearheads to grant them victory. To feel the shape of a rune, to trace its sharp lines with a fingertip, is to feel a connection to that ancient belief. A belief that a simple symbol could hold a secret, a mystery, a piece of the cosmos itself. These symbols of power were inscribed on the branches of the great tree that held all of existence together, the cosmic ash, Yggdrasil. At the very center of the Norse cosmos, there was not a god or a throne, but a tree, an immense, ancient ash tree named Yggdrasil. Its name is thought to mean the steed of the Terrible One, a reference to Odin and his hanging from its boughs. This was the axis of the universe. Its branches reached up into the heavens, and its 3 great roots delved deep into the primordial realms. Yggdrasil was the structure that supported all of existence, the 9 worlds that made up their universe. Let us take a gentle, drifting tour of these 9 realms, from the highest branch to the deepest root. At the very top of the tree, in its highest branches, lay Asgard. This was the realm of the Gear gods, the world of Odin and Thor. It was a fortified kingdom of golden halls, like the Great Hall of Valhalla and Thor's immense Hall of Bilskirnir. It was the realm of order, of power, and of divine society. Not far from Asgard, in the upper levels of the tree, was Vanaheim, the home of the Vanir gods, the world of Enjar and Freya. This realm was associated with fertility, with magic, and with the natural world. It was a place of deep, ancient wisdom, older than Asgard itself. Also in the heights of the tree was Alfheim, the home of the light elves. This was said to be a bright and beautiful realm, filled with light and ethereal beauty. Its inhabitants were described as being fairer than the sun to look at. A world of pure, gentle radiance. In the center of the great tree, held between the realms of fire and ice, was Midgard, Middle-earth. This was the world of humans, our own world. It was said to be surrounded by a great, impassable ocean, where the world serpent lay. It was the realm of the mortal, the everyday, the world that the gods sought to protect. Surrounding Midgard, in the same level of the cosmos, was Jotunheimr, the world of the giants. This was a land of chaos, a place of jagged, icy mountains and dark, tangled forests. It was the embodiment of the vast, untamed wilderness that always threatened the fragile order of Midgard. Deep beneath the earth, in the root system of the great tree, was the home of the dwarves, who were sometimes called the Dark Elves. This was a subterranean world of caves and forges. Here, the master smiths of the cosmos worked metal and magic, creating the greatest treasures of the gods. At one of the great roots of the tree lay the primordial realms. In the distant north was Niflheim. This was the world of ice, of mist, and of primordial darkness. A cold, formless place that existed long before the gods. In the distant south lay Muspelheim, the world of fire, a searing, incandescent realm, guarded by the fire giant Surtur. It was from the clash of this fire and the ice of Niflheim that life first emerged. And finally, under one of the great roots, deep in the cold north, was the realm of Hel. This was the underworld, the land of the dead. It was a gray, quiet place, ruled by Loki's daughter of the same name. This was not a place of punishment, but the final, silent destination for most souls. The great tree was not static, it was alive. A great eagle was said to sit at its very top. A dragon, named Ni-Hggr, gnawed at its deepest root. And a squirrel, named Ratatoskr, scurried up and down the immense trunk, carrying insults between the eagle and the dragon. Yggdrasil was a living, breathing cosmos, a world of wondrous, interconnected realms. Within these 9 worlds, the journey of the soul after death was a complex matter. For most, the destination was not the glorious halls of Odin, but a far quieter, grimmer place. The popular image of the Viking afterlife is a simple one. A brave warrior dies in battle and is carried away to feast and fight in Valhalla. But for the Norse people themselves, the journey of the soul was a far more complex and far more somber affair. Valhalla was not for everyone. In fact, it was not for most people. The Norse may have believed in a soul that was made of several different parts. These parts could have different fates after the death of the body. This is a complex idea, but it helps to explain the many different destinations for the dead that appear in their myths. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, was the home of Odin, but it was not a heaven, it was a barracks. Odin sent his Valkyries to choose from among the warriors who died in battle. But he only chose half of them. These warriors, the Einherjar, would spend their days fighting and their nights feasting. But this was not a reward. It was training. Odin was building an army for the final doomed battle of Ragnarök. It was an afterlife that served his needs, not theirs. The other half of the warriors slain in battle went to another place entirely. They went to the field of the people. This was the realm of the goddess Freya. The nature of this afterlife is less clear in our sources. It does not seem to have been a place of eternal battle. Perhaps it was a more peaceful, pastoral existence, a quiet reward for a life of struggle. But what of everyone else? What of the people who died of old age, of sickness, or of accident? What of the farmers, the merchants, the women, and the children? For them, the destination was hell. This underworld was not a place of punishment like the Christian hell. There was no fire, no torture. It was simply a gray, cold, and shadowy place. A quiet, misty reflection of life, ruled over by the solemn goddess of the same name. The dead were sometimes buried with special hell shoes to protect their feet on the long, hard road to this final home. There was also a powerful belief that the dead did not always travel far. Many believed that the deceased continued to live on inside their own burial mound, their hogger. Here, the dead person, now a creature known as a draugr, would guard the treasures buried with them. They were not ghosts, but physical, corporeal, undead, who could interact with the world of the living, sometimes benevolently, but often with great malice. There is even some quiet evidence for a belief in rebirth or reincarnation. Some sagas hint that a soul could be reborn into a new child, often within the same family line. Children were sometimes given the name of a recently deceased relative, perhaps in the hope that the ancestor's spirit and good fortune would live on in them. The afterlife was seen as a continuation of life on earth. This is why the grave goods were so important. The dead were buried with their tools, their weapons, their jewelry, and with food and drink. They were expected to need these things in the next world. Crucially, the destination of the soul was not determined by a moral judgment. It was not about being good or evil. It was determined simply by the manner of one's death. A warrior died and went to one place. A farmer died and went to another. It was a calm, practical, and accepting view of the soul's quiet, final journey. The 9 worlds were populated not only by gods, giants, and humans, but by a host of other beings who wove the fabric of fate and dwelt in the corners of the cosmos. As we drift towards the end of our journey, let us gently picture the other beings who populated this rich and vibrant cosmos. The world of the Norse was never empty. It was filled with a vast and wondrous bestiary of creatures, spirits, and forces, each playing their part in the great cosmic drama. At the very root of the world tree, by the well of Ord, sat the 3 most powerful beings in the universe. They were the Norns, 3 mysterious female figures whose names were Or, Vergandi, and Skuld. What once was, what is coming into being, and what shall be. They were the weavers of fate. With a loom, they spun the threads of destiny for every being in the cosmos, from the smallest human to the greatest of the gods. Not even Odin could change the fate that the Norns had woven. Serving the will of Odin and the fate woven by the Norns were the Valkyries. the choosers of the slain. These were female warrior spirits. They would descend upon a battlefield, invisible to most, to decide who would live and who would die. They would then carry the souls of their chosen warriors up to Asgard to become part of Odin's great army. The cosmos was home to the elves. There were the light elves, the Leosulfar, who lived in the beautiful realm of Alfheim. They were said to be creatures of light and beauty. And there were the dark elves, or the dwarves, the decay, or diverger. They lived deep underground in the realm of. They were master craftsmen, the greatest smiths in all the worlds, who forged the magical treasures of the gods. There were the spirits of the dead, like the Draugr, the Aginwalker. This was the animated corpse of a dead person, often one who had been evil or greedy in life. They would guard their burial mound with ferocious strength, a terrifying physical ghost. And there were the spirits of the land itself, the Landvader. These were the protective, benevolent spirits of a particular place, a forest, a waterfall, a farmstead. The first settlers of Iceland had laws that forbid ships from approaching the shore with their fierce, carved dragon prows raised. This was done so as not to frighten away these gentle, protective spirits. We have met the great, monstrous children of Loki, the Fenris wolf, whose destiny was to kill Odin, the Jarmungandr serpent, who would be the death of Thor, and the goddess Hel, the solemn ruler of the dead. These were not simply monsters, they were primordial forces of destruction. The world was also filled with wondrous animals. Odin's 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, the fastest of all horses, who could gallop across the sky and between the 9 worlds. And Odin's 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin. Their names mean thought and memory. Every day they would fly across the cosmos and return to whisper all the news of the worlds into Odin's ear. This world was alive. It was a cosmos filled to the brim with beings, from the great Norns weaving fate to the quiet spirits protecting a single field. It was a world of deep mystery and of profound connection, a world where every part of existence, seen and unseen, had its place in the great final story. The threads of fate have all been woven. The stories have been told. The echoes of the old gods now fade into the quiet of your room, becoming part of the gentle fabric of your dreams. Thank you for joining us on this long journey into the dark heart of the Norse world. Your presence here makes these explorations possible. We hope our story has brought you calm, comfort, and now a deep and peaceful sleep. Until our next bedtime history, from all of us at Sleeping Scribe, sleep well.